I'm Craig Patrick, joining you from the famous Ocklawaha River. For the next half hour, we'd like to take you all along one of the most beautiful rivers in the world. But we can't.
It's very devastating to realize what was there and what was lost.
This is the story of one of Florida's greatest natural treasures crushed and mangled.
It looked like a war scene. That's the closest analogy I can come up with. It looked like it had been bombed.
By the failures and follies of the Cross Florida Canal.
It's a waste of money. We're throwing money into a rat hole.
And it created a long-running controversy that's coming to a head.
So the Rodman Dam is 55 years old, and it is a 50-year-old shelf life. And so any day now, something is going to happen.
And it all starts some 90 years ago with an ill-conceived plan that became Florida's Boondoggle. Well, our government made a big mistake that burned taxpayers and damaged our environment over and over again. They tried to build a canal through the middle of Florida and repeatedly failed. And the damage they left behind touched off a dispute that we're still dealing with today. If you walk through the woods of Central Florida near Ocala, you might stumble on something that looks a little weird. It's Florida's version of Stonehenge. Most people have no idea where these pillars came from or who built them or why.
It was a boondoggle, total boondoggle. And it's a shame that it got as far as it did.
And it all started with the idea of literally sawing through the state of Florida as depicted by Bugs Bunny.
That does it. South America, take it away.
This Looney Tunes cartoon aired in 1949, 14 years after an army of men actually tried to do it. To try to cut a major shipping canal through Florida as part of FDR's New Deal.
Through a well-conceived and actively directed plan of action.
The plan was to make a shortcut for large ships in the Gulf so they wouldn't have to curve around Florida to reach the Atlantic. The idea had been floated around for hundreds of years. And engineers said it would take a lot of work and did not make economic sense to do. But during the Great Depression, Roosevelt keyed into the part about it requiring a lot of work.
Hundreds of thousands given new employment.
While he launched successful civil works projects across the nation, he approved this one big doozy called the Cross Florida Ship Canal. They put down $5 million and planned a $146 million budget. In today's money, that's a $112 million down payment on a budget of $3.2 billion.
You know, we can do it, but why?
University of Florida professor Dr. Stephen Knoll is a leading expert on the follies yet to come. And he wrote a book about them called Ditch of Dreams.
There's great stories that people who were opposed to it thought that once Florida separated, that the part below the canal would float away. You know, so this is the kind of absurdity that we have here, both from proponents and opponents.
It's actually not that hard to believe people thought the southern half of Florida could float away if you followed more recent debates in Congress.
Is there anything that the National Forest Service or BLM can do to change the course of the moon's orbit?
Just 14 years ago, our military had to assure a congressional hearing the island of Guam would not tip over if too many people got on one side.
My fear is that the whole island will become so overly populated that it will tip over and capsize.
We don't anticipate that.
So we can see how 90 years ago they could not anticipate the true impact of digging a big hole through Florida.
Up to a mile wide, so basically they're clear-cutting the land.
They built a base camp south of Ocala called Camp Roosevelt.
They work hard, and they're going to play hard.
Thousands of men made 30 cents an hour. That's around $6.75 here today.
They're also going to spend it on liquor and women.
And that's what fueled the rise of adult entertainment in Central Florida.
It's the Wild West.
And on the West Coast, they started slashing and digging near Yankeetown, dumping huge piles of sand in the Gulf. And that's what created the shoals and the bird islands off the Citrus County coast today.
The spoil islands out there in the Gulf that seabirds today nest on are relics of the failed canal in the 1930s.
And as they cut east, they did much of the work by hand and used mules instead of readily available machines.
Would have been the smart way to do it, would have been the quicker way to do it, but the object here is to give people jobs.
Another classic hallmark of a boondoggle.
Deliberately inefficient.
Yes, deliberately inefficient, deliberately designed to make sure that people have jobs, yes.
And tough, unpleasant work.
They're out in the woods, there's ticks, there's chiggers, there's rattlesnakes.
Which compelled this man, George Timmerman, to try to organize a labor union. Guess what happened to him?
On the front page of the New York Times says, labor organizer crucified in Florida.
They found him in the woods with nails through his hands and feet.
Crucified, mouth sewn shut, and it's amazing that he survived.
But Ocala's police chief dismissed it as a publicity stunt and claimed he must have done it to himself or had an accomplice do it.
And he disappears.
And that's what chilled the organized labor movement in Florida.
We tried to find, what happened to him through census records and everything. He's gone.
And while the engineers drew up a lot of different possible cut lines, the government picked one which ran through the middle of a thriving African-American township called Santos. It was the home of a proud baseball team and a hub for Negro League games. But beyond this old ball field, you'll find just one building still standing, an old church, and some signs in the woods for others torn down, all forcibly bought out and wiped out for pennies on the dollar.
They were moved for something that never happens.
And just a couple of blocks away from Santos, they built the stanchions for a tall highway bridge to cross the ship canal. And that's how we got those weird pillars in the woods, as well as rectangular cuts through central Florida land. And if you look at a satellite map of Florida, you'll see the scars the whole fiasco left behind. Which brings us to why they never completed this canal that would have been 40 feet deep.
What happens when you go 40 feet deep?
You hit the Florida aquifer.
It would have flooded salt water into Florida's primary source of fresh drinking water.
Well, I think the most amazing part of that is that they didn't think about it.
Thankfully, farmers in the Tampa Bay and Orlando areas realized what was about to happen and knew it would ruin their crops.
These salads are for the northern winter market.
They warned Congress and the president they were about to lose their salad ingredients. And with that, a plan to keep funding the Cross Florida Ship Canal failed in the Senate by one vote.
But the story of Florida's boondoggle does not end there. In fact, it's still playing out because 30 years later, they decided to bring it back. Coming up, we'll show you how they revised the plans to spare the aquifer, but wound up causing a lot of other damage along the way.
Engineers have long dreamed of a Cross Florida Canal.
Actually, engineers who studied it said it was not economically feasible. It's the politicians who were dreaming, and we all got burned.
We lost a whole swath of natural Florida.
First, in the 1930s, FDR's plan to build a ship canal through the middle of Florida nearly spoiled our main source of drinking water.
They said, oh yeah, that's exactly what will happen. It will allow seawater to get into the aquifer system.
Congress shut it down in 1936, but then World War II brought it back to life. A German U-boat sank the SS Gulf America oil tanker 5 miles off the coast of Jacksonville. And Congress reauthorized the canal to help protect tankers from deep water attacks. And they changed the design so it would not rip into the aquifer.
A toll-free, lock-type barge canal, higher than sea level.
So instead of being 40 feet deep, it would only be 12 feet deep and designed for barges instead of large ships.
It will utilize a series of locks, and the barges will be lifted up by these locks in a series of steps.
They changed the name from the Cross Florida Ship Canal to the Cross Florida Barge Canal.
A tremendous new industrial belt will rise along the canal.
It would look like New Jersey. And they said this in a positive way. We want Florida to look like New Jersey.
And look like a lot of other things that just did not add up.
This means that countless parks, picnics, and camping areas and swimming beaches.
Because who wouldn't want to camp and picnic to the steady flow of industrial barges? And who wouldn't run from the sugar sand beaches along the coast for the chance to swim in this?
That we can have water skiing and, never again, the irony of having water skiing in an industrial waterway.
While Congress authorized it during World War II, it did not appropriate any money for it until President Kennedy pushed for it in 1963. Or we should say until Kennedy's close friend pushed him.
The president's good friend and groomsman at his wedding, Senator George Smathers, is in the president's ear.
And I regard him as one of my most valuable counselors in moments of great personal and public difficulty.
Ironically, while Smathers was advising him to restart the canal, Kennedy joked that Smathers advised him to run the year that he lost.
George came up and said, "I think it looks pretty good for you."
And advised him to not run the year that he won.
"George, what do you think?" He said, "Don't do it. Can't win. Bad year."
Kennedy drew laughs by saying he still listened to Smathers.
George comes right up there and gives his views, and I listen very carefully.
And all joking aside, Smathers sold him on that canal. Congress approved $4 million as a down payment days before Kennedy's assassination, and 3 months later, LBJ followed through on it.
Well, I was 6 years old and living with my grandparents.
Tom Deputy's grandparents received a coveted invitation to the groundbreaking that promoters claim would be bigger than the Beatles.
So grandmother loaded us up and drove us up here. It was a rainy, cold day, and we came out here and we watched Lyndon B. Johnson drive up in a big black limousine right through the mud and all.
What did your grandmother tell you as you were seeing this?
Oh, how important it was for the rest of my life to remember history like this. And there was one of those box plungers. And we watched him, they did a countdown, he pushed it down and...
He blew up a huge mound of peat moss engineers had trucked in just for the event.
It pleases me to report to the people of Florida and the nation that the long-sought Cross Florida Barge Canal is now well underway.
And while FDR's failed canal ripped a scar through Citrus County and Marion County, LBJ's failure tore up much more to the east.
Real damage is done in the second go-round, yes.
And unlike the 1930s when they mostly used mules, this time they used monsters. At least they called this a monster. They also called it Paul Bunyan's bull, but they mostly called it the Crusher.
Instead of cutting things down, this huge tank, who's more like a military tank, would go running across them and just crush them in.
To blitz through forests about an acre per hour and change natural rivers.
The idea is to straighten it out, turn it into a canal cut.
For environmentalists, it was a disaster.
It looked like a war scene. That's the closest analogy I can come up with. It looked like it had been bombed.
And then the miles of crushed trees sort of got their revenge.
Well, it's a little bit, in some ways, like a Stephen King movie.
Because they did not anticipate what would happen when the squished wastelands began to fill with water.
The type of trees that were felled are the types of trees that float.
Some called it the attack of the zombie trees.
But of course, like corpses, they all started rising to the surface.
So they had to chase them down, stack them in huge piles, and burn them.
It's a horrific environmental site.
All while people in the shipping industry said, we're not really sure we can use a 12-foot barge canal through Florida anyway.
In Palatka and Putnam County, man has done his planning well.
Moving of freight through by barge canals was out of date because the interstate highway system was largely constructed by then.
In the interest of our space effort, giant boosters and missiles will be moved safely by barge.
Assuming giant rocket boosters can maneuver through a narrow canal that's only 12 feet deep.
Well, the canal is not big enough to handle those things. So, the irony is the assumption that we can use it for this is not there. So, in addition to the ecological and environmental damage, once again, it's a boondoggle. It's a waste of money. We're throwing money into a rat hole.
And doing lasting damage to one of Florida's natural treasures. The Ocklawaha River remains dammed off and cut off.
We lost the striped bass altogether. The manatees have found it very difficult to get up and down the river.
Coming up, we'll show you what finally stopped this canal project and the fight over restoring the river.
I invite you now, on behalf of the state of Florida, to watch a brief, informative film on the amazing Cross Florida Barge Canal.
It was amazing in terms of the miles of crushed land and the millions of dollars wasted. Our federal government tried to build a barge canal through the middle of Florida that engineers said would not pay off and that major shippers didn't need.
Most people understood we didn't need a canal. It was an antiquated idea and nobody thought that this would be funded and go forward.
But before it was canceled, it inflicted a lot of damage. And one special river took the hardest hit.
It's very devastating to realize what was there and what was lost.
Captain Erica Ritter grew up on the famous and winding Ocklawaha River.
Crooked as a snake.
And she gives tours of what's left of it today.
It is a wild and scenic river. We're in a section of the river that would be similar to what the steamboats would have experienced. It was a narrow canopied channel, and it was usually most times of the year very clear water.
It flowed freely north from the chain of lakes in central Florida to Silver Springs and the St. Johns River, or at least it did.
If we could transport ourselves back to Florida in 1935, we would think it's Eden.
It was a tourist paradise going back to the late 1800s.
The reflections off the canopied foliage and off the river turns it into a fairyland.
Long before rockets and theme parks, this canopied river was the crown jewel that drove Florida tourism, with the testimonials from the likes of President Grant, Thomas Edison, and Mary Todd Lincoln.
In the olden days, when they had steamboats on this river, they would come at night through these wonderful narrow channels, and they would light torches on the steamboats for the tourist. And so you could see the eyes of the alligators shining in the distance.
Author Harriet Beecher Stowe, who had turned her readers off the blight of slavery, later turned them onto the beauty of this.
They compared it to the Amazon or the Nile or the Congo, even though they've never been to those places. But it's one of those wild and natural rivers that they see as going away.
And rolling with striped bass and sturgeon and wildlife they had never seen before.
And strange creatures in the river like manatees. What are those?
And this is what they dammed up to build this reservoir to serve that ill-fated barge canal.
Rodman Reservoir is already filled to its engineered boundaries.
Here's the part of the river that continues to flow, and here's where they bottled it off for the canal. And here's where they cut off most of the natural flow to what were some of the most beautiful parts of the river. And they also cut off the natural path of migration for a lot of the fish.
Well, a sturgeon, for example, they were in the river at one time too, but they're gone. We lost the striped bass altogether. The manatees have found it very difficult to get up and down the river.
And that's where the naturalist who opposed the barge canal entered the picture. And Marjorie Harris Carr led the resistance.
Marjorie Harris Carr was a mover and a shaker. She didn't take no for an answer.
In 1969, she and a small group of scientists and activists formed a group called the Florida Defenders of the Environment.
She literally runs this operation out of her kitchen with mimeograph machines and volunteers.
Carr and the Defenders produced an environmental study that revealed the barge canal's toll on the environment. And they sued over it, fueling a tangle of extraordinarily complicated litigation.
And lawsuits in which, unbelievably, the Army Corps of Engineers is both plaintiff and defendant in the same lawsuit.
And they got Reader's Digest to publish a piece called Rape on the Ocklawaha.
Reader's Digest is the journal of Middle America. And they read this and say, wow, this is crazy. What's the purpose of this thing?
The protest reached President Nixon, and he issued an executive order to cancel the barge canal project in 1971.
Nixon sees this as an opportunity. These people who hate me, if I do some environmental stuff, they might like me.
But while they suspended construction of the canal, they just left what they had already constructed behind. For example, here's one of the locks. We could not go through it and wouldn't want to because it leads into a green mess and a dead end on the other side. And as we track north toward Palatka, we find the biggest thing they left behind. They did not take down the dam, and it still redirects most of the water from the river and divides Florida to this day.
At some level, it's a cultural divide.
A powerful state senator named George Kirkpatrick lobbied his fellow lawmakers to keep the dam in place. He said the reservoir behind the dam has good bass fishing and helps the surrounding economy. And it sparked a long-running battle between Marjorie Carr and George Kirkpatrick.
It's bass boats versus kayaks is what it is.
And state leaders sort of split the difference. They turned the land that had been set aside for the rest of the canal into a 110-mile-long park or greenway and named it after Marjorie Carr. And they kept the dam on the Ocklawaha and named it after George Kirkpatrick. both spent their final years fighting over the dam, and both died more than 20 years ago. But now this story is taking yet another turn as lawmakers take a closer look at the dam.
So the Rodman Dam is 55 years old, and it is a 50-year-old shelf life. And so any day now, something is going to happen.
So will they replace the dam or will they finally take it down? Coming up, we'll hear from both sides as state lawmakers face a big decision.
One of those cormorants caught a fish and the osprey stole it from him.
Tom Deputy has an eye for birds and a quick trigger finger. And he captures amazing pictures because he knows what to look for at just the right moment. He spent most of his life around the waters of Putnam County, and he picked a very interesting place to capture nature because it's at the center of a long-running clash.
Oh, my godfather was one of the loggers that followed the crusher.
Around 60 years ago, his godfather helped clear swaths of forest as tanks crushed miles of trees to build this massive reservoir near Palatka that restricts river flow towards central Florida.
What kind of things did your godfather say about the project?
You know, to him it was a job. It was, you know, to make ends meet.
A job in the 1960s to build a barge canal through the middle of Florida. It became the largest public works project in U.S. history that never came to be.
The trade of the nation will funnel into and through this canal crossroad of Florida.
The Cross Florida Ship Canal and its successor, the Barge Canal, were canceled due to swelling costs and mounting environmental damage.
It was crushing my front yard, so the crusher crawler was not my favorite machine.
The total actual costs are hard to nail down, but appear to be more than $70 million through the decades, or more than $700 million in today's money.
So that $700 million went into a ditch.
And it includes the construction of this dam in Palatka that blocks the migration of fish and manatees south, submerges natural springs, and restricts the famous Ocklawaha River.
Heartbreak, sadness, blocking the fish. It's I'm put it as a foot across her throat.
And this has triggered a battle that's played out for more than 50 years that may finally be coming to a head.
Of course, growing up here, I know everybody, and some of them are very, very strong-willed about their decision on yay and nay, both sides, and I see both sides.
And so do we when we meet people fishing near the dam.
You've got a lot of people on that lake have valuable property. They built on that lake for a reason.
Those who want the dam to stay include nearby homeowners who say losing the dam would drain this water.
It's going to smell bad, I can tell you that.
And drain nearby property values.
Because it's going to be a mud pit in the backyard.
Those who want to keep the dam also say it's good for fishing, though this depends on who you ask and when you ask. Years ago, the dam kept a lot of fish in. But over time, it's also restricted a natural path of migration in and out.
And then they all travel down through these systems into the natural springs to, repopulate. But when you have these systems like this and these locks and these dams controlling the water, it controls everything else as well, which depletes the fishing population, and it just hurts everything on the ecosystem, really.
You're saying the fishing would be better without the dam?
Yes, I think it would.
And people who live south of the dam as you head toward Orlando and Tampa feel the effects.
You've got a lot of what I think is economic development that's tied up in having the dam there by those that like to guide fishing and other things. The con is that that's not the natural state of the river, and there are a lot of properties downriver that would like to have the natural flow restored.
And now the dam is aging, and the Army Corps of Engineers National Inventory classifies it as a high-hazard potential dam. That means if it fails, it carries the potential for significant damage and probable loss of human life.
And we have to decide whether or not we're going to take a proactive stance to return the Ocklawaha back to its original form or replace the dam and keep it as it is now.
Since President Nixon stopped the Barge Canal, the federal government has favored removing the dam. And every Florida governor has also supported removing it until Governor Rick Scott took over. He took no public stance. And Governor Ron DeSantis is also not on record either way.
Have you gotten through to Governor DeSantis?
We met with his chief of staff. We met with his head attorney, some other staff people. They all were shaking their head. Yeah, it makes sense to do this.
And what did they do after that?
And that's where the screen goes dark. Nothing.
Well, as the dam continues to age, the state will eventually have to make a decision of whether to replace or remove it. And that will be the next and possibly final chapter in this long-running story of the Cross Florida Canal. Thank you for watching this special presentation of Fox 13 News.